November 30th, 1906. Crossing Cherry Park yesterday, I encountered a sick dog expelling from its body worm-like creatures. It was particularly offensive, but I found myself drawn to watching the worms move about on the ground after dog and owner left. I wondered at my own fascination and the lowly act of observing excrement in the dirt. I thought what I might do if one of my schoolmates were to see me, or worse yet, Mrs. Browning. But a stronger thought overwhelmed me, an understanding that was too powerful to turn away from. It was this, the worms showed me Mr. Soper's scientific theory. They showed me how one creature can live inside another, eating it from it. Once sated, the creature is expelled out into the world through the feces, where another animal can pick it up. It became clear to me how the fever spreads. If the cook uses the toilet while she is working and doesn't clean her hands well before returning to the kitchen, she passes the typhoid creature, bacteria, he called it, out of her body and into her households. Mr. Soper has told me that these germs are shaped like noodles, and maybe they have limbs and that propel them. Fascinating how living things can live inside us, but I still don't see why Mary doesn't get sick herself. I must figure that part out, if I can. I wish I could get to the laboratory and look through the microscope and see for myself what this typhoid germ looks like. But Mr. Soper has not yet responded to my few subtle queries to that effect. In fact, he had me working all week at the task of contacting every employment bureau in the city by telephone to find Mary Mallon. I've never used a telephone, and I was quite excited at first. I had the impression a voice would magically appear on the other end, like in a conversation. Instead, it required heavy manual labor to produce a reply. You have to crank the handle on the square wooden box to speak to the switchboard operator, and that handset, like holding an iron against my ear. Half the bosses I reached seemed to be answering from beneath the river. The other half had tin throats. Most times I had to yell and repeat my query and pressed the set so close to my ears for replies. I feel as if I've been pummeled. I studied the instrument, the box, the wires, the metal handset, and still cannot figure out how a voice can travel through it all. Mr. Soper says the telephone converts the voice into electrical impulses, which vibrate the wire and then are transformed back into what sounds like a voice. It has to do with the characteristics of sound waves. An invention of affection, he called it. Mr. Bell created the telephone to communicate with his mother and his wife, who were both deaf. By the end of the week, I was almost wishing I had one of the convenient contraptions at home, imagining Anushka had one too. The wonder of it was, finally, that I could locate the cook's present employment bureau, and all without taking a single streetcar trip. From the bureau, we found out the cook currently works for a family on Fifth Avenue. Mr. Soper spent some time thinking of how to approach her. I imagine she must be wondering why it is that typhoid follows her to each job, he said. I think she'd be grateful to know that she carries a disease inside her and spreads it like a spice in her cooking, I said. Of course, I did not mean it to be a joke. It was simply the picture that came to mind. But Mr. Soper's brow darkened at my words, and he barked at me sharply. Prudence, this is an epidemic we're facing here. This woman is very likely responsible for a girl's death, and the illness of so many others, and a humorous approach will not help her fathom the gravity of the situation. We must find a way to explain this in a proper manner to her, in a way she'll understand. His admonishment still rings in my head. I apologize, but Mr. Soper hardly heard me. My foolishness hung from me like a sign. He went on. If she knows the possible danger she is bringing into households, if she is made aware of it, I believe she'll work with us. We need to convince her of the importance of testing, that we must check her bodily fluids, urine, blood, and feces. We must tread lightly with her, however, as this is a new theory and not yet proven. Surely she'll understand that she's connected somehow, I ventured to him, trying to make up for my joke. We'll approach her at her place of work. The laboratory results will give us our answer. He turned his attention to another task in the office, and I watched him for a minute over my typewriter. Here is a man who has not solved epidemics, who has not only solved epidemics, but other things too, like the running water they installed in our neighborhood's tenements and the toilets they put downstairs. All of this to conquer those things that cause death. His goal is cleanliness, an orderliness that will bring health to everyone who lives here. I feel sometimes as if I'm drowning in a sea of unknown and Mr. Soper is like a ship passing. I call to him, but my mouth is full of dark water, and soon he is out of reach. He seems to work all hours, and never speaks of a family he must return to, not even for the holidays, like Thanksgiving. He is the first person I've met whose home I cannot imagine. He never seems to need a rest. He lives for his work. One day I hope to be like him, my whole soul focused on my work, to the exclusion of all else. Yet I think I would be lonely without my family. We spent the holiday with Aunt Rachel and Uncle David in Williamsburg, and they were so generous, baking pumpkin pie and turkey legs, mashed yam, and challah bread to celebrate the coming of the Pilgrims and the Red Man. Uncle David invited a man from the factory, and I'm not sure how to feel about him. Directly after supper, Marm sat alone, apple-cheeked in the corner, until the man went over and presented himself to her. It seemed expected that the two of them would meet, this man and Marm. I believe Uncle David invited him for that purpose, and I watched Marm very closely for her reaction. It's been 8 years since my father left, and in all that time, men's attentions have rolled off my pretty Marm like water drops. I think my absence and the emptiness of my long work hours away from the apartment has given her thought. Maybe she is worried I'll leave her. Maybe the day has come. Maybe my matchmaking aunt, as she has tried in the past, has succeeded in convincing her it's time. The thought hardens my stomach. This man from Uncle David's factory is handsome, with rounded features and a streak of gray in his otherwise dark hair. His eyes look directly and intelligently at a person. Despite Marm's discomfort, he was impressively persistent and discussed all matters of subjects with her. But Marm is not like her sister Rachel, comfortable in her marriage to the same man for 22 years. She, like me, is used to being alone. A peachy rose glow rose on her cheeks as they spoke, and she laughed at the things he said. Her eyes flitted to me, seeming surprised at her own laughter, guilty at it even. Yet she seemed engaged, happy, joyous, in a way that I haven't seen her in a long time. I have to say, it bothered me. I loved to see her so happy, but I worried about my father, what he might think, what our neighbors would say. Marm with another man. Yet even Mrs. Zansberger thinks Marm should surrender to the thought of my father's return. Before the night was through, the man was able to extract a promise of an outing with Marm. I cannot imagine her out on an outing with a man. It doesn't fit. She is otherwise occupied. She is married. She's mated for life until death. Later, I overheard Aunt Rachel and Uncle David talking in the kitchen about Marm marrying this man, and that made my throat hurt. What if the day came and my father returned and Mom had married Mr. Silver? What would happen to my father? What would happen to me? I feel torn by this man's appearance, concerned for my lonely Marm and fearful of my father's broken heart, should he ever return. I feel we should wait for him, just me and Marm alone, even if that means waiting forever. Receiving his checks is a reminder of him every month. It keeps alive the hope that he will come back, despite what our neighbors and friends say. I talked with Marm about the man on the way home, and she seemed to view him kindly. He is a friend, Prudence, a gentle person to talk to, one who knows your aunt and uncle. That's all. He seemed keen on you, I said. She pulled me to her and kissed my cheek. We held hands. She said, I know what you're thinking, and there's nothing to worry about. He knows about your father, and he mentions only friendship. That's all? I asked. That's all, she said. I worry that my Marm contains pockets of loneliness that even a daughter cannot fill. When I think about my father, I feel as if he and I are in a dense fog. He's backing away from me slowly, the edges of the fog closing in on him, making it harder and harder for me to see him. Any day, I fear, he'll turn away from me and be gone from my sight forever. December 7th, 1906. I have not been able to rid my mind of the look on that woman's face, a wide-eyed dread at first, then a closing, smaller, as if her features were swelling shut, and the anger turning her freckles a deep brown, spotting her high forehead. The fear, what is it from? I cannot figure out this cook. Cannot figure out this case. It seems to be getting more confusing to me the further we proceed. Monday morning, cautious and grave, Mr. Soper and I took the elevated train up 6th Avenue to 57th Street and marched our way to Central Park and over to 5th Avenue, up to the mansion where Mary Mallon works. We rang the bell and said we were from the Department of Health and Sanitation. We know now not to mention our real purpose until we speak to the head of the household. The very pleasant butler showed us up to a dazzling parlor, where he asked us to wait while he fetched his employer. But his kindness gave me an eerie feeling. He seemed to be expecting us. Mr. Soper briefly met my eyes in question as we waited. I couldn't help admiring the polished shine on the fixtures and the floors and the window glass. I wondered how a disease might come to such immaculate homes. How did it manage to survive in places with maids who swept and scrubbed daily? It was easy to see it in my own building, where we all live so close together and can practically feel each other's coughs through the walls. But in a large, sparkling house with so few people, how did the bacteria continue to live? The butler returned and said his employer would be down shortly, as soon as he finished tending to his wife. Mr. Soper asked what ailed the wife. The butler seemed bewildered. Didn't you state you were from the Department of Health? He asked. He thought we had been summoned by his employer. "We are in fact investigating a typhoid epidemic," Mr. Soper answered. "Typhoid, yes," the butler exclaimed. "The same disease that has felled the missus. Their daughter was hospitalized with it last night." A gasp slipped from me. It was unprofessional, but I couldn't help it. At that moment, the man of the house came into the parlor and sank into the sofa. He was dressed in night shoes and gown. He rested his forehead in his hands and sighed. "I'm so glad you're here." Mr. Soper sat across from him and said, "My assistant and I were engaged to hunt down the source of a typhoid epidemic that probably began some years ago." "The vomiting started after we took Melissa to the hospital," the man said. "I'm sorry," Mr. Soper said. "I must be clear. I'm not a medical doctor." The man looked up and Mr. Soper went on. "I'm investigating this epidemic. Our findings have led us here. I believe you've hired a cook named Mary Mallon. We have reason to think she has unwittingly brought the disease to you." "My cook is not ill," the man said. "She never has been." "I understand," Mr. Soper said. "We believe she doesn't need to be ill to carry the typhoid." "I've never heard of such a thing," the man said. "We only ask that she submit to testing at our officers," Mr. Soper said. "But her bureau says the only sickness she's ever had was the common cold," the man said. Maybe he was distracted by his worry, but the man was very resistant to the idea that his cook carried the typhoid disease. Mr. Soper insisted, "We must have the chance to test her. It's the only way to rule her out." "I think you're wasting your time, but if you say you can prevent the spread of the disease," the man said. He showed us to the kitchen and introduced us to a tall, flame-haired woman with a knife in her hand and a half-cut onion on the chopping block before her. This was Mary. I could not stop myself from staring at her. In my mind I had pictured a Medusa, a pox-ridden hag with missing teeth and long, dirty fingernails crawling with worms. Yet standing before us was a woman who looked proper and stately, hair in a bun, apron neatly ironed, nails trim and pink. Mr. Soper started off by telling her we were from the Department of Health and Sanitation of the City of New York, and she resumed slicing her onion. "My kitchen is clean," she said. There was not a mark on her skin. Even her collar was starched and brilliant white. "With all respect, Miss Mallon, we have reason to believe you may be involved in the carriage of typhoid without your knowing it," Mr. Soper said. "What do you mean I'm involved?" she said. She spoke with a thick Irish brogue. "I ain't been sick a day in me life." I don't mean to poke fun at her accent by writing in this way. I simply want to test the degree to which I can accurately relate these details. Mr. Soper asked her to think back over her work history. "I work for a dozen loverly families," she said. "What about 'em?" "The disease seems to follow you, doesn't it?" Mr. Soper said. "Wouldn't you like to know why that is?" She glanced quickly at her employer, who seemed impatient and upset. "Aye, I know why 'tis," she said. "The city's full of sickness. Everywhere you look, there's people droppin' with the typhoid and the croup. 'Tain't no surprise, mister. People get sick all the time." Mr. Soper persisted. "Yes, but the typhoid in particular seems to follow you, ma'am. It's not a careful disease. If one is not careful, disease can enter the food one prepares, especially raw, uncooked food, like peach ice cream." The woman stopped slicing and looked up. Her employer interjected here. "Mary is a cleanly person and a fine cook. Of course she washes. I wouldn't hire anyone who wasn't completely scrupulous in every way. This is a waste of time. I must get back to my wife. Please, let me show you the door." Mr. Soper didn't move. Uneasy tears watered Miss Mary's eyes. She squinted them away and said to Mr. Soper in a bitter voice, "You saying I ain't clean?" "We could solve this issue if you would simply come to my office and give a sample of your fluids," Mr. Soper said. His voice softened as he got more frustrated with the stubborn people. "My what?" the cook said just as quietly. "Your fluids," he repeated. "What in the world?" She started to protest, and my chief interrupted. "Your fluids, such as your blood, for example, will tell us if you carry the disease." "You want blood?" she screeched, scaring the life out of me. I had feared she had completely lost her mind, shouting that way in front of the master of the house. "Mary, please," her employer said. Mr. Soper said, "Your blood, yes." She took the knife in her hand and stabbed it into the chopping block with a high-pitched yell. "I'll give you blood." Her employer turned to us. "Mr. Soper, why don't you find the real reason for this typhoid, for God's sake, instead of upsetting my staff?" Mary struggled to remove the knife. The man waved his arm. "Please, I have to ask you to leave. I have enough problems without your wild accusations. But all I ask for is one small sample. If you don't leave, I'll have to complain to the department." Mary hollered, "Get him out of here. Out. Out with your foul ideas. Go on." Her eyes rolled up. I could see the whites of them and her teeth. "Please, ma'am, it's very important that we test you." She screeched and yanked the knife out of the block and started coming around. Mr. Soper turned on his heel, scooted me out of the house in front of him. And that was the last we spoke to her. A disaster. Not at all what we imagined, this woman. Not in the least. The incident disturbed Mr. Soper profoundly. It has put a brick wall in our way. All week he muttered to himself that we must get to her. We must explain to her so she'll understand. I watch him sifting through the records, repeating to himself that we must figure out a way to have her tested, or she will continue spreading the fever, and someone else will die.